Good afternoon. I have a question. Has God ever done something in your life that just made you scratch your head that you didn't understand? I, I think I think the disciples felt that way in this story I want to share with you. All of us are very familiar with Jesus feeding the 5,000 people. And imagine being one of the disciples. Man, that must have been amazing to see Jesus do such an amazing miracle. And surely you would think that after watching that, they would realize that Jesus himself was God. But the story we're going to look at today says otherwise. And in fact, Jesus does something that may make you scratch your head. In Mark chapter 6, right after the feeding of the 5,000, it says in verse 45, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples go back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida. While he sent the people home, after telling everyone goodbye, he went up to the hills by himself to pray. So picture this. The disciples have been a part of feeding a crowd of over 5,000 people. And Jesus rushes them into a boat and says, "You go to the other side." But Jesus doesn't go with them. And you see, they were about to enter into a test. They were about to go into a storm. And it's interesting here that Jesus sends them into the storm. When you read the events of the feeding and Jesus sending his disciples away, you realize in other gospels it's recorded that the people, the crowds at that time intended and wanted to make Jesus their king. I mean, who wouldn't love a king that could feed the multitudes? But Jesus understood that that was a test that his disciples weren't ready for. They needed to be built up so that they could handle that down the road. But the test they were going to face that day, Jesus knew they were ready for. Jesus goes up to pray. It says, late at night. Oh, the hours and times that Jesus spent in prayer. It says, late at night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. They've been rowing for some time. It says he, Jesus, saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. He intended to go past them, but when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him. Here's these sailors. They're out there struggling in the sea. And Jesus comes walking out. In fact, he was going to go to the other side. That's where he said he'd meet him, right? But they panic. They're terrified. In the other Gospels, we see here that Peter even cries out to him and says, "If it's you, Lord," and Jesus says, "Come on out." But Peter himself looked at the waves and the storm and began to doubt and sink. But it says here, but Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." Isn't it amazing how in the very presence of our fears, some of the fears that aren't even real, Jesus wasn't a ghost. He was very real. And the fear of the storm, Jesus says, "Hey, take courage. I'm here. I'm with you. Then he climbed into the boat and the wind stopped. They were totally amazed, for they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of loaves. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. Jesus understood. They were learning. They were learning who he was. They were learning to trust him. And Jesus uses this event to teach them faith, to strengthen their faith. But go back to the beginning. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples go back into the boat. Friends, there's times that Jesus is going to insist we get in that boat. He's going to insist this is a storm you need to go through. But he has his purpose. And on the other side, our faith will be stronger for it. He understood they hadn't learned yet, but they were learning. There's things you and I still need to learn. But each storm that he lets us go through, he promises he'll be there with us. I pray you have a blessed day, realizing that regardless of the storms on the horizon or the storms you may be in, Jesus is there with you. Have a blessed evening.